It's a great pleasure to have my good friend Joel Klein. I met him many years ago when he was at the Justice Department terrorizing Microsoft with David Boies as his Sundance Kid, and they were part of the antitrust case against Microsoft. We went to a restaurant once in New York called Le Chat Rouge, in which he explained to me on a paper tablecloth the entire theory of antitrust and Microsoft. He's, of course, went on to other great things, most notably being the Chancellor of the school system of the city of New York under the mayoral terms of Michael Bloomberg. He now works for a wonderful company that I have the joy of being somewhat of a consultant to, which is Amplify, which is making digital curricula. So he's somebody who does a lot of what we try to do at the Aspen Institute, which is to turn thought into action. The other thing he does that we try to do at the Institute is show leadership based on values. So his new book is Lessons of Hope, How to Fix Our Schools. Let's start with the title. What gives you hope?
Well, first of all, let me thank you. In fairness, you always tell this part about how I sued Bill Gates, and then the inference is, and that's why I ended up to be school chancellor, because I had so few opportunities left to me. But the part you don't tell, which is really important, is that despite it all, Bill became my biggest financial backer and gave us $150 million to do school reform in New York. Now, that's a lot of money even for Bill Gates, but as one of my principals pointed out, just think what Gates would have given us if I hadn't.
Yes, right, exactly.
I called it Lessons of Hope for a very important reason, and that is, first of all, what I wanted to convey at a time when so much in school reform seems to be people banging their heads together, arguing about many things that I think are really not particularly productive. That doesn't mean there aren't important arguments. That there are things we know and learn by experience which ought to inform what otherwise can be a pretty arid philosophical debate. And there were things that I learned in New York. Not everything that we did worked, and I say that, and certainly the overall outcomes weren't as great as I had hoped for, although there was real progress and improvement. What I tried to say is, let's try to pick our way through this in a way that understands where there are opportunities, things that are working, and try to get behind that. There's so much ideology in school reform that gets in the way of looking at what's really going on and trying to get people to coalesce. And if we could leave some of the ideology and move to some of the things that are working, it'd be helpful. Now, I have to admit, if you read the book, there's a lot of pushback and a lot of fights with the unions, which Walter will get into, because he loves to watch me fight with other people. That's one of Walter's great
Randy.
But so when the book first came out, some kid on the Twitter, and I finally started tweeting at age 68 because I came out with a book, and I saw how many followers Walter had, and I was jealous, so I got out there and started tweeting. And some guy on Twitter wrote, "I've read Klein's book. I don't know, he must have been a typo. It should have been Lessons of Nope, not Lessons of Hope." But that's why I called it Lessons of Hope.
You have a chapter, I think, called Making Leaders, and one of the things that's astonished me is how many great leaders came out of your tenure in New York. Go across the country, and people have worked for you. How do you spot good leaders, and how do you help train them?
So it is an important question, and one that I think is quite complex. And from my point of view, one of the things that I think started in New York with Mike Bloomberg. I mean, what Bloomberg did was really remarkable. He said he wanted operational control of the schools and be held accountable. And I told him, I said, you know, that's a very noble sentiment, Mike, but there's no large urban school system in America you can point to and say, that's a great one, let's just replicate what they're doing. So I said, whatever we get done here, we're going to end up doing a lot of splaining, because there's no miracle fixes in K-12. And so to me, leadership is really the core quality in any organization. When it came to school reform, the reason I had this chapter on making leaders was I was astonished. Because to me, the thing that matters in schools, in school systems, are schools. You know, for unions, politicians, bureaucrats, chancellors, they care about systems, they care about districts and all that. But everybody in this room who has ever had a child, what do you care about is the school. And if that school is good, you're happy, and if not, you're in deep trouble. And if you're going to have good schools, you're going to need good school leaders. And hey, JC, talking about great leaders, that's one of them.
Jean-Claude Brizard.
J.C. Brizard worked with me in high schools, went on to run Rochester and Chicago, is doing great work now. Really a pleasure to see you here, talking about leadership. But to me, what was really paradoxical, remember I came to this from so far outside the system, that when Bloomberg announced that Joel Klein was going to be the school chancellor, most of the people reported that Joe Klein, the guy who had written Anonymous about the Bill Clinton, was going to be, that's how unlikely I was. As I say to Joe, I said, what are the odds that you were more likely than I was for this job? But it was so broken in so many ways, and this way more than any way, which was the principal was not a job that people focused on. It was the weakest piece in the food chain, meaning that it was the bureaucracy kind of weighed down on them, and the union contract weighed up on them, and so they had virtually no degrees of freedom. If you think about New York, half of your vacancies for teachers could be selected by seniority. You didn't even have a chance. When you say, how do you interview them, how do you look for them, and so forth, you didn't even have a chance to do any of this. So we had to change all of that. And our cornerstone became leadership empowerment and accountability, setting up a leadership training program, empowering principals, holding them accountable, signing performance agreements. And I think this was a critical piece, but I still think it's a piece we're not well focused on in New York or throughout the country. I never forget, when I decided, the first move I made was to give all my principals the right to pick their assistant principals. Before that, these 32 community soups used to pick the principal and then assign assistant. So I said to the superintendents, this is ridiculous. And they said, well, you can't do this. I said, why? He said, well, our principals don't know how to pick assistant principals. So I said, well, if we got principals who don't know how to pick assistant principals, we've got to start all over again here. Can you imagine somebody trying to run a school that can't assemble a team? I mean, whether it's at Aspen Institute, whether it's at IBM, or whether it's in a school. If you can't put together a team, you cannot do the work.
So how did you get the right for them to hire and fire teachers?
Oh, in one of the back-breaking chapters in the book, this was the toughest negotiation I had with Randy Weingarten. And I got only half the right to hire, not the right to fire. But that was a big deal. If you ask principals in New York, they would say, and I think JC would confirm this, that the ability to hire at least meant they had some control over going forward. And they would be careful because they knew they didn't have much degrees of freedom in terms of trying to fire them. Now, to go back to your question, the issue of how you select leaders and how you train them is critical. Where I think we're okay at is how we train them. I still think we're not very good at how we select them. And one of the things that I kept trying to do, and I would ask my people who were picking principals to rate them in terms of their likelihood of success and see how good their ability was to predict how well our principal. And I found that it wasn't great, to be truthful. That in fact, the school system mantra, which to me is a stupid mantra, is we can tell for teachers, for principals, after they've been on a job for 2-3 years. Well, in a system where you can't get rid of anybody, that could be forever. So focusing on selection. Now, I spend, and I'm sure you do this, when I hire people for leadership positions, whether it's JC or one of my deputies, I mean, I spend a ton of time with those people, really sort of looking at their leadership experience, asking them about the things that didn't work. You can tell a lot about a leader from the things that he or she failed at. Asking about the things that did work and why. Seeing what their values are in terms of team building. Asking them what they think the magic ingredient in their sauce is and trying to articulate. So to me, that is, in the absence of compelling data, the way I would do it. But if you ask for one of the big holes in K-12 is we haven't figured out yet what are the factors we should be looking at that will help us identify a priori, not after they're on the job. Training them up, and this is where, I mean, one of the more controversial pieces of the book is I asked Jack Welch to help me on leadership training. Bringing Jack Welch to K-12 was definitely sending a signal. And you know, when he started out, where he on our first press conference with the mayor and me, he started out by basically saying, you know, this whole thing is broken. We got to take a big swing at it. It ain't going to be easy. I took him to his leadership program, and I brought the 100 top people in the department, a place called Crotonville, which was the Jack Welch Center for Leadership Training. And I was amazed. He spent the whole weekend with us. And several things that happened illuminated so much about Jack. First thing, after everybody talked about it, and he asked them, describe what you do in the school system. And they said, without exception, I'm an instructional leader. And this lit him up. And he said, you people are so afraid of leadership that you caveat it. And he said, when you run a school or you're a superintendent, you are a leader. And while instruction may be the game you're in, you've got to do so much more than it. You've got to understand budget. You've got to be able to do human resources. You've got to have vision for your team to build on. You've got to have a culture that permeates. If you don't get that, I don't care how good you are in instruction. And you think about it, K-12, we automatically assume someone's a good teacher will be a good principal. And that to me is not at all. And indeed, if you thought about it, we would pay differently. The reason a lot of people move out of the classroom into the principalship is because they get paid more, and in a pension-driven system, it makes more sense. But we don't think rationally about those things. So training up for leadership, and when Jack said that, you could see the jaws drop. The other thing he said to me at the end of the weekend, which I relate in the book, which was amazing, he said, you know, Joel, I learned so much this weekend, but I'll tell you this, you got a hard job and I'm never coming back. And I said, why is that, Jack? And he said to me, because I spent a weekend with people who don't like to have fun. And nobody succeeds in organizations that don't like to have fun. And that's the trouble with school systems. There's something about people in the school bureaucracy that if they're not suffering, they think they're not doing a good job. And so so it was really amazing to me because it was so profound what Jack said. And he was so right about it. You know, taking yourself seriously is a bad thing. Taking your work seriously is a good thing. But having fun while you're trying to change the world is really, really critical. So we came back the next time without Jack to Crotonville. He let me still use Crotonville as a favor, but he wasn't coming back that. So we go to Crotonville, and each of the people who were there at the last time, I had to say, what'd you learn at the last meeting? And I was the last to speak, and I said, well, I learned why God created wine. And they said, why is that? And I said, because he was at our last retreat, and he saw how little fun we were having. Starting tonight, everybody's going to have to drink wine and do karaoke. Yeah. And I got my, JC may remember this, but I got my general counsel, who was a pretty stiff guy. I got him doing breakdancing that night. That's how smashed he was. And it really changed, but this goes back to my whole thing about what leadership is about. Changing culture. People who are having fun want to do more of it. They don't look at a weekend like that as a time when they're sort of being forced to be away from their family. They looked at it as a real, and you could change the sense and the meaning and ultimately the quality of work we get done. And I learned a lot of that from people like Jack, who obviously, whether you agree with all his policies or not, was a pretty powerful and profound leader. And we were attracting people like that. Dick Parsons came. I'll never forget when Dick came to talk to us, and he said, you know, he learned everything about leadership when he was class president in the 3rd grade for 2 years in a row. But that was, you know, it really livens things up when people do that.
So you tried to create a school system that depended on school leaders, as what you just said. And in your book, you said you tried to disentangle the whole thing so they couldn't put the whole system back together. It had to be more schools-based. How did that work?
It worked pretty well because, I mean, it doesn't work perfectly. If you follow in New York, they're trying to, you know, the Mayor de Blasio is trying to undo some of what we're doing. But it worked pretty well in the following sense. The big core initiatives rearrange the status quo. We shut down 150 schools, they're not coming back, right? He may not shut down more schools, but those 150 are. More important than the 150 we shut down is the 600 that we created in their place. Those people now are a constituency. So when you if you try to change that and roll it back, you're not going to be able to do that. One of the things that Machiavelli taught us that's very powerful is, and I hate to cite all these great cynical people like Machiavelli, but it's really powerful. Status quo.
Jack Welch and Machiavelli.
Well, I didn't want to say that about Jack. but Jack might find it a badge of honor, who knows. But one of the things that's really powerful about a status quo, especially one like I was running in New York. When I started, it was running at about 13, 14 billion, went up to over $20 billion a year. There's a lot of people who are influenced by that kind of thing, and those people are going to defend the status quo. You know, when Joel Klein comes along and says, I think it's a good idea, we got to have teacher evaluation, and somebody's got 21 years out of the necessary 25 to get a very good pension and lifetime health insurance, and I come along and say, you could lose your job in your 21st year and you won't get your pension. People don't think that's a great idea. Now that's part because of, so I don't expect that just because I think it's a good idea that we should evaluate teachers, everybody's going to get on board with the thing. And so to some extent, this was kind of how you navigate that kind of world of change and change it so that you have new status quo. The best implementation of this, and it was amazing, was we opened up under Mayor Bloomberg almost 200 charter schools in New York. And that's controversial. There's no question about it. It's controversial. But those 200 charter schools now have somewhere around 80,000 people. And when Mayor de Blasio tried to cut back on it, out of that 80,000, about 10%, 12% of them literally went up to Albany to protest on a freezing cold day. And Governor Cuomo saw these people freezing out there in the cold, all people of color, defending charter schools. And he all of a sudden decided, as warm as it is in the governor's mansion, I got to go out there and be with those people. And that was a profound flip point. Now, what people hadn't understood is, by changing that status quo and creating those 80,000 people who are willing to fight like hell, you actually made it almost impossible to unravel and undo. So when you're trying to do systems change, one of the things to think about, there's some things like putting a letter grade on the school. The next guy or the next woman could eliminate those. But creating constituency makes it much harder. And change management depends on constituencies who will come in and fight for it. So if they tried, and they thought about this, because the union doesn't like it, if they tried now to force place teachers on schools, like they did when I started, where you just show up and say, my name is Walter Isaacson, I've got 18 years in the system, you've got a job for a fourth grade teacher, I'm your person. And the guy says, well, can we talk about it? I say, nope, under the contract, I'm entitled to it. If you try to go back to that system, the principals in New York, I think, would recoil. I think they wouldn't put up with it. So that's why changing things that create a different constituency are really important to whether it's lessons of hope or any systemic change that you try to implement.
What was the role of charters in pushing change, and how much further would you go if you could have?
I would go as far as I could go to bring high-quality charter schools, whether the KIPS and the Uncommons.
And what about choice, where they compete for students?
Kids. Well, that's a big part of what it is. You know, this is one of the things. School choice is controversial, and I've always thought it's only controversial when it comes to poor people, because everyone in this room would insist on choice for your kid. There's nobody here who's allowing me to randomly assign your kid to the DC public schools. Nobody. I mean, in New York, when I used to ask this question, people looked like me. I had 3 heads. I mean, so anybody of any means and opportunity insists on choice. You may move to a neighborhood where you love the public school and you go to a neighborhood school and you pay more for your housing for that. So what I said is, first of all, most things that are good enough for affluent people, usually good enough for poor people, so we ought to try to give them some choice. And second thing I said was, it will bring competitive pressure. Now, people don't like that. People, I mean, one of my experiences with Microsoft was, people who have real market power like market power. So when we decided to bring these 200 new schools, and remember, not one of them, not a single one of them had to take any kids. They all had to be people who applied. And we put them in our high poverty neighborhoods. We put them in Harlem, put them in central Brooklyn, we put them in the South Bronx. And that then changed those areas, because for the first time the public schools were looking around and saying, if we don't get these kids, they're not automatically coming to us. Before there was an alternative. If you had 100 kids each year, you were going to get those 100 kids, whether you're good, bad, and indifferent. So that had real catalytic effect. Then what happened, which is probably equally or in some respects more important, one of the big myths in K-12, and I want to get this out clearly, is that somehow poverty is destiny, and 90% of the outcomes are dictated by the fact that the kids grow up in high poverty communities. So what you need is proof points that say those very same kids in a different school are going to do a whole lot better. That's not to say that poverty doesn't matter and kids who come from dysfunctional families don't face challenges that kids come from middle class and affluent families don't experience. It's not that at all. But despite the challenges, if you start to see schools that are getting very different outcomes, like Success Academy in New York that Eva Moskowitz runs, some of the KIPP schools which had doubled and tripled the college-going rate for minority students, when you start to see that, it puts pressure on the system to say, well, why isn't that happening? If it's happening at KIPP, why isn't it happening at PS11? And then that helps you get some wind to your back when you're trying to do reform. And
if you were able to design a school system from scratch, like we did in
like
New Orleans,
you did,
would you make it all choice, all independent schools? I mean, schools that were public but had their own autonomy.
So what Walter is alluding to is one of the really remarkable experiences. Very few good things ever came out of Katrina, but one of them was they got a do-over in their school system. And their school system before Katrina in New Orleans was awful. Thanks to Walter and a handful of other people who really, he was originally from New Orleans. He's too modest to tell you this, so I'll tell it to you. I mean, he really decided it was his civic responsibility to get engaged in the rebuilding. They brought together just the kind of charter maintenance organization I'm talking about, the KIPS and so forth, to come down to New Orleans and create an all-choice system. Far from perfect, but a whole hell of a lot better than what they had before there. Working through a lot of issues. But for example, before Katrina in New Orleans, African-American kids, which are the overwhelming population of the school system, African-American kids in New Orleans were way behind African-American kids the rest of the state. Now African-American kids in New Orleans have shot ahead of African-American kids in the rest of the state. Family satisfaction has gone up. It's true that kids have to travel a little more sometimes to find the school they want, but that's a choice. They can always find a school closer if they don't prefer it. So they've created a real-world experiment, one that's getting not perfect, but good returns, attracting a lot of good young teachers to go down there, and it's become a big model. So if I were the czar and I could start all over, I would create a much more portfolio-based type of choice system. Those that are good, I would replicate and ask to expand. I'd go back to them and say do more. Those that are doing poorly, I would close.
You know, I was just down in New Orleans, and one of the schools in my old neighborhood of Broadmoor Central City, we took over as a very local charter. My brother was on the board of the Wilson School and did all sorts of innovative things, like stayed open till 7 at night, et cetera. But it became failing, and so about a month ago, it was decided it was near the bottom, it was going to be shut down and the charter taken away, and so they called me to come down and say, can't you help protect our neighborhood charter? And I went to the meeting. At the end, I said, hey, we made the rules. We lost the charter.
It's very painful.
And now it's a KIPP turnaround school.
Yeah, it's the right decision, but it's very painful. When you sit before a group of people, I mean, I found the hardest work I did, other than spending lots of long nights negotiating with the union, but the hardest work I did was closing down schools, because there's three constituencies that hate. The people who are there, it's their school. It's the old story about everybody hates the Congress and loves their congressperson. Well, everybody hates the public school system, but they love their school. So you got that constituency, the people who are there, which includes the parents and the kids. Then you got all the alums who haven't been there for 50 years, but they remember it in the good old days, and how can you change my school? And they write these really terrible letters. And then the third constituency is teachers, because when you close the school, they got to go find a job. So that gets very ugly. We used to have these meetings in New York, because we had to go through a process to close them down. And they'd go to 2, 3 in the morning, and there'd be 1,000 people in there, to the point where, you know, and anything I said, they would scream and yell, you know, because as I say, the people who are going to benefit from the schools you put there instead of the schools you shut down, those people, they don't show up because they don't know from nothing. And the people who are losing something, well, no, how are they going to, what do they know what's coming or whatever? One we did, which President Obama, I started the book with President Obama now made a big thing, called P-Tech. We shut down a school called Paul Robeson, which was a school I went to where I thought a kid was going to die. He was shot. And we shut it down and replaced it with several schools, including this thing that I cooked up with IBM that's now a 9 to 14. 4 years of high school, 2 years of college. You get out of there, if you get past the certification test by IBM, you get a job as a technician as long as IBM's hiring. So this has become a model school in that very same building where gangs were running the school building. So shutting down schools is tough stuff.
You talked about attracting good teachers when it happens, and young teachers. You're on the board with me. We're both on the board of Teach for America. What role do you think it's played?
So I think Teach for America has played a couple of 3 roles, and it's become more controversial because I think in part it's become successful. And there was a little boutique in 1992 when Wendy Kopp took a PhD thesis and turned it into a program. But it's played, the first intermediate role is it's brought an enormous generation of talent into the public schools and expose them to that. Second thing it's done is in high poverty communities, it's created a culture of higher expectations. And that's really been critical in terms of people who are expecting more from kids, who are willing to work longer hours, and that's had real benefit. The third, and in my view, long-term most important thing it has done it's created a leadership class in K-12. So there are more superintendents, more commissioners, more heads of not-for-profits, more people going into politics like Michael Johnson in Colorado, who's in the Senate there, and so forth and so on. So
two successive chancellors in the city of Washington.
In the city, Michelle Rhee and Kaya Henderson, Cammie Anderson. I mean, you could, John White, who's now running Louisiana, who, you know, you could go around the country. Kevin Huffman, who just left Tennessee. So it's become this great pipeline, and that, I think, is high value. What it's one legitimate criticism of it is most of its people don't stay for past 2 or 3 years, and at least in my view, kids in the system 2 or 3 years is suboptimal. It's not, depends what the alternative is. It's not a complete knock on what's going on, but more people staying 7 years, so forth, I think the system would stabilize better.
Mm-hmm. You talk in your book, and just mentioned it a few times, having to deal with the unions, having especially Randy Weingarten and the American Federation of Teachers. You brought in a high-powered labor lawyer, right, Lamb? Yeah, and
No, Weisberg.
Oh, Weisberg, sorry. I think you described interviewing him secretly, if I remember correctly. Why don't you tell the story and how those negotiations played out?
Well, so I didn't want anybody to know what we were doing, because bringing in a high-powered labor lawyer was not the kind of thing that the sort of chancellor usually did. I mean, there's a famous story about Rudy Crew, who was one of my predecessors, and when they had a big party for Sandy Feldman, who was Randy Weingarten's predecessor in New York, and they all got up to toast, and Rudy got up and said, Sandy, he said, of all the people I've ever worked for, working for you has been the greatest honor for me. And she was the head of the union, and he was the head of the school system. So he had it right, basically. He understood the game. So bringing in a high-powered, aggressive labor lawyer was not seen as a friendly sign. So I didn't want people, I was in this building with all the bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats were oftentimes part of the ancien regime. They would be talking to the union. So I didn't want anybody to know what I was doing. So there was this little staircase where I had them bring them to, where I interviewed him under a little light that was like this. So, and I also was a little bit of a leadership test. I thought if he was more interested in how big my office was than what I cared about, we'd see what happened. And I hired Weisberg. He's now at the New Teacher Project, doing incredible work. I mean, and again, one of the things that I loved about what happened in New York, there are more people like JC now who become lifetimers in the K-12 sort of space, and so many of them came out of New York. A lot of them like Teach for America, like Cammie and John White and so forth, but a lot of others, Chris Cerf, who went on to be commissioner in New Jersey, JC, who, as I said, went to Chicago and so forth, and Garth Harries, who's now running New Haven, and it really, people got it in their blood and in their DNA, and that's another reason for Lessons of Hope, is when you get people who are some of America's most talented people willing to commit their lives to improving K-12.
What was the most important thing you two won from the union, and what was the thing you lost?
The most important thing I won, no question, was this right to hire. I mean, it was, and then the most important thing I lost was the right to fire. There was, when I left, and to this day, although Cuomo's got a very aggressive agenda on it now, but to this day, there's no meaningful teacher eval in New York. There was a story in a Post on Saturday, which is shocking, that someone was rated unsatisfactory 6 years in a row, late all the time and everything, got a 45-day suspension and back to school. And, you know, this is really ridiculous. At some point, it's not about a fair process. It's that not everybody should be a teacher. It's too important. And we should have reasonable processes, but we never got to that point. On the other hand,
Steve Brill helped with the rubber room.
The rubber room helped a lot.
Yeah.
Steve Brill helped a lot. He's got another good book out, like you.
Bitter Pill?
Bitter Pill.
We're actually missing an event for him as we speak.
As we speak.
Yeah, being competed against.
That's a bitter pill for both of us.
That's right, exactly. Let me ask you one more on the controversial topic, core curriculum or Common Core?
So, core curriculum is different from Common Core, so I want to make two different things. Standards seem to me to be essential. These standards, like any set of standards, are imperfect, but they were bred out of the following concern. Under No Child Left Behind, the states design their own tests, and they basically find that 80% of their kids are proficient, which if you're a governor or a mayor or a school board is good to run on. Then we know from the national exams, the NAEP, that in fact about 35% are proficient. So what we find is that these kids are proficient, they graduate high school, and then half or 60% of them are not prepared for college. This was true in New York, it was true all over the place. So what Common Core was trying to do was align to career readiness. And the standards themselves, I think, are quite solid. Smarter people than I would dispute this standard or that standard. Two things followed from it that got controversial. One was that the Obama administration got behind it, and that led all of a sudden in a lot of Republican states, anything that was touched by Obama. So I'll never forget Bill Bennett, who actually is a supporter of Common Core, used to be Secretary of Education. He once said the wisest words in education I ever heard. He said, America will never have national standards. He said, the Republicans don't do national, the Democrats don't do standards. No, but let me tell you, there's something. Man's no fool. I mean, he may not agree with him on everything, but he's no fool. So the fact that the Obama people got into this meant that all of a sudden this was no good, even though we were higher, more rigorous standards. Then the fact on the left that the standards were more demanding and could be used in teacher evaluation, making it harder to be successful, all of a sudden you got this unholy coalition of the left and the right to go up against them. I think that's a mistake. I think we can't keep graduating kids who are not ready for college. These kids in New York, they would go to community, they would get a high school degree, they'd go to community college, and they'd feel frustrated because they didn't know math, they couldn't read, and they didn't know how to write. Other than that, they were well educated. But, I mean, you would see a kid graduating in most, SJC in Chicago, a kid graduating most of his schools who graduate right at the margin. I'm not saying the kid's got a 95 average. That kid graduates, you read an essay, you would think I was making it up. You would think I was drinking and wrote this thing. So it's not a winning formula. Now, curriculum doesn't get mandated, although it should align with standards. And one of the things that I worry about with curriculum, and I write about in the book, is there's too much what I call self-referential curriculum. Meaning, it's a lot easier to talk about what do you feel about, what do you think about, which is an important set of questions. Mm-hmm. But it's very hard to learn what are the real forces that led to a civil war, what were the implications. And the example I gave, this is a true story. I walk in a classroom, a high school classroom on American history. Teacher's first question is, what was the Civil War about? It was about slavery. What was slavery about? Racism. Third question, who recently here has experienced racism? Now everybody's talking about racism. So I interrupt and say, well, if this is all about racism, why did we have slavery in the South and not in the North? Because surely there's racism in the North in the 1860s because there's racism today in the North. And like people looked at me like, we're talking about my experience, Chancellor. What kind of question is that to ask? And this worries me a lot, is the lack of knowledge-based curriculum. People used to scream at me all the time. And I learned this the hard way. I learned it from a guy named Don Hirsch, E.D. Hirsch, at UVA. And particularly for minority kids from high poverty communities and kids from poverty generally, the lack of vocabulary, the lack of background knowledge is going to make them poor readers. The average kid who came to me from a poor community in New York compared to a wealthy community had about 20% of vocabulary, and that gap doesn't shrink over time. So developing background knowledge as a constituency, Daniel Willingham just wrote a book about this on reading, another guy from UVA is terrific. It's really critical, and this doesn't get enough attention. It's not about the standards, this really is about the curriculum. And one of the things that Walter mentioned at the outset, you were nice, is he's been helping us some on our digital curriculum. And one of the things that our curriculum is built on is really sort of intense reading and significant background knowledge development, because I think that's critical to our kids. So the fight on Common Core, the good news is most teachers, when they use it, like it. We're going to see a sort of wake-up call this year because it's about 30 states are now using the new tests. And what you're going to see is in those states, proficiency rates that used to be 60 and 70 and 80% are going to drop to 30 and 40 like they did in New York and Kentucky. And that's going to create a whole bunch of political pressure, make the issue more intense in the 2016 election. But I'm hoping that teachers and kids actually think it improves what goes on in teaching and learning. And if it does, it'll navigate these treacherous political waters.
Tell us about Amplify and the role of digital tools in creating a new type of curriculum.
So my theory, one of the things that I felt when I left the school system after 8.5 years, and as somebody pointed out to me, those are dog years. So you're talking about the better part of my adult life, almost 60 years.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I was convinced that we're demanding and expecting too much of teachers without giving the help and the support. And that whatever happens on hiring and firing and so forth, America has a teaching force of about 3.3 million, 3.4 million teachers, and giving them help and support. And there are things you can do through digital curriculum that you just can't do in the classroom. Simple little things like putting Shakespeare both acted on adjacent to the words, so that the kid, so many kids who can't really get their head around Shakespeare, when they watch it being acted on the same page, get into the words, doing dramatic readings, giving teachers the kind of vocabulary. So we have on our thing an e-writer and an e-reader, and what you do is if you don't understand the word diligent, you click on it. Without the teacher doing a single thing, the student gets 6 little lessons that come to him or her on the word diligent, including a little assessment. And then you use the word in the e-writer, and all of a sudden the teacher gets a report that Klein mastered the word diligent. And you can customize and personalize vocabulary. There's so many things like that we've built into it. Scoping it, sequencing it, so you know that Roald Dahl should follow Edgar Allan Poe, not come before. And giving teachers all this help. But everything is done that the teacher orchestrates. And if she don't like this particular piece, she can leave it out. If she wants to add something, she should add it in. But it's so easy when you do it in a digital way. And I actually do think this is going to be a big part of the future. It's not a world of MOOCs. It's not saying put a kid in front of a screen. It's much more a teacher-orchestrated experience, but with the benefits of what a digital curriculum. We were having the hardest time getting kids in New York City. We did a lot of play testing. We're having the hardest time getting them to read Frederick Douglass. And it's a really important book when you think about it, because this guy put his life at risk to learn to read. And so it sends a very powerful message to these kids. It's a beautiful book, but it's pretty archaically written. And we couldn't get him to read it. We even tried different things. We finally hired this guy, Chadwick Boseman, who did James Brown, and he did Jackie Robinson, and put him in street clothes, and he did a dramatic reading. As a result of it, my wife wanted to read Frederick Douglass. It was so powerful. And you can get that for every kid. And we've done studies now that show if you do it with Chadwick Boseman, how long they stay with the book, how much they retain, because he only did the first chapter. They had to read the rest on their own. So those kind of things I think are going to work, and others are doing this. It's not just amplified, but I think this is part of the future. What I think we need to be careful of is a Sunday Times op-ed this weekend that I read, which sounded right to me. It's nothing inherent about technology that's going to improve education. It's whether technology can impact what I think is the critical interface, which is the interface between teaching and learning. And if it can make teachers more effective at what they're doing, kids more engaged at what they're doing, then you've got something. But technology itself could put a kid on a website with all sorts of trouble and all sorts of bad things going on. So it's not technology, but really how you impact the teaching learning experience.
As always, I have to thank Alma Gildenhorn for help in putting these things together. And let me open it up. Go ahead. Yeah.
I want to thank you for giving me hope. I'm a retired school principal from Michigan. And you touched on every hot-button issue I lived through. From my one concern from volunteering here in the district in a charter school, I don't see teachers lasting because there are so many demands for them, for their work. And I see no union, to use a bad word, protecting them.
Well, the whole question of burnout in charters, which is an issue in New Orleans that we're talking about too, I think it's a real issue. What I want to see is sort of long-term data on this. I mean, what's interesting to me, 6, 7, 8 years may be a different career trajectory than what we're used to. And I at least am not sure that in the modern world that's such a bad outcome. But 2 to 3 years would be hard.
Yes.
Thanks for giving me hope.
Go ahead.
Thank you for
Mr.
what
Rao.
you did.
Yeah.
Jonathan Roush of Brookings. Thank you so much for your emphasis on the quality of principals. I started my career in journalism covering a big school system and quickly learned 2 things. First, the quality of the principal is the single most important variable in the quality of the school. And second, it's the last thing that reformers talk about. Question, if you could wave a magic wand and make teacher unions go away nationwide, would that be a good thing?
I would make them into professional organizations. I mean, it just seemed to me, first of all, go back to what you say on principle. I wish more people heard what you said. I've been preaching it from day one. When people, I say in the book, when I was asked when I took this job, and I didn't know much then, but I was asked if I had one skill that I was better than anybody else out in the world. Goes back to Walter's question. I said I'd like to be the best principal picker in the whole world, because I think that's so critical, and it's so under-focused on. Why is it under-focused on? Because the union, the teachers union, has all the big membership, and the bureaucracy has all the power. And the principals are sort of stuck in the middle in this vice, and they have very little power or respect. So I think it's critical. On unions, it always seemed to me that Al Shanker, who was the most iconic teachers union leader in America, in 1985, way back then, wrote the piece that said he's a guy who brought collective bargaining, struck in New York. Woody Allen made him famous by saying he got hold of the atom bomb and blew up the world in a sleeper. And Shanker wrote in 1985, The Making of a Profession, and said if we don't have a second revolution in K-12, in which teachers move away from this trade union model into a professional model, we're not going to succeed. And here we are 30 years later, and we still haven't moved down that path. If anything, there's greater retrenchment. So I think there is room for professional associations. In countries where it works well, I think that's the way the union sees itself, not as a kind of trade union, seniority-based, lockstep pay, tenure-based system, but as a much more professional organization. That's the model I would opt for, and that's the model I think we need.
Yeah, over here. The woman behind you, thank you very much.
Sorry. I'm curious to hear your opinion about the value of neighborhood. So not all charters across the country have the same policy about having to take the neighborhood kids versus complete choice. So New Orleans, New York, DC, all different policies, even within the charters. But we know neighborhood and community matters in general for society. What is your opinion about that? Should there be an approach where charters have to take neighborhood kids and they become a school of right, in essence?
I think we should have a mix. I think we should have schools of choice and schools of right, and I think we should have a mix. And certainly in places like New York, we had preferences. So if you came from Harlem and you wanted to go to Democracy Prep, you got in. If there were extra seats, you could lottery in. It's a tough question for the following reason. I think neighborhoods do matter. Yet in this city, which I'm very familiar with, the number of people who send their kids a whole lot further out of the neighborhood in order to get a good education, and they can afford it, seem to be pretty instructive. So saying to other people, well, we're only going to give you one, doesn't work. Now, if you set up the kind of thing you set up in New Orleans, and you could give preferences if you want, and in fact, what I found when I set up all these high schools of choice, which were not charter, but they were public, and I set them up, I would say about 20% of the kids traveled in a big way, and the rest stayed pretty local. And that seems to me to be the way to sort it out. What bothers me is the one and done. And that, so having charters with geographic preference doesn't bother me nearly as much as simply saying it's PS 11 and we're going to make it better. You know, at some point, there's no third grade again for this kid. So making it better is a little hollow promise.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Thank you for your comments. I'd like to pose a somewhat different challenge here, and that is, in the beginning of your talk, you said ideology has gotten in the way. Wouldn't it be possible to look at it that we haven't really developed and connected with the kind of ideology that America operates with at its best, i.e. that we're all legitimate and we all care and we all have high expectations. So that when you talk about professionalism, which I think is commendable, would that not include legitimacy? And as a aside here, comment, Race to the Top. Race to the Top became a very upsetting program that came directly from the top, when we don't even know what the top is in America.
Why don't we let Joel take those on? Thank you.
Sure, no, well look, some of what you're saying I think is right, and it seems to me we ought to create a set of, if you will, values and infuse it. But I would start with some pretty basic ones, one of which I've been banging my tin cup on for a long time, and that is everyone who can afford it insists on school choice for their children. So why do we insist for the kids who can't afford it that it's one and done. That to me is the number one principle. Number two principle, America, and I've heard this so many times, America believes so deeply in equal opportunity. I hear people preach, it's not about equal outcomes, give every kid an equal opportunity. And yet we take the kids with the greatest challenges in life, who grow up in the toughest environments, and we give them the worst education. And then we say, well, everybody had an equal start. I mean, who are we kidding? What kind of value structure is that? We should kill ourselves. For a kid who comes from a dysfunctional, troubled family, we should kill ourselves to give that kid a great education. Probably the most haunting quote, the people who read my book never knew this, but the most haunting quote in my book is from Frederick Douglass, who said it's easier to build strong boys than to fix broken men. And we're missing that out. The first 5 years of a kid's life, we're doing virtually nothing during the years of brain plasticity. So those are the values that we ought to infuse. We should be taking money and moving it down, particularly for kids who come from the most challenged environments, because for those kids, there's an opportunity. Same way my kid learned vocabulary from 0 to 5. For those kids, we can create environments. But we got to do this stuff intelligently. But as long as we say the two things that matter most in a kid's opportunities in life are family and school, and we're allowing a whole mass of kids to be 0 for 2 when we could be doing much better. That, to me, is what the value discussion has to be about.
Liz?
Hey, Liz, how are you?
Fine. You mentioned in passing that Mayor de Blasio is trying to undo some of the things that you've done. What are the significant ones? Why? Is it unions, or what is it, what's that about? And is there danger of real damage to what some of the things you achieved?
Well, let me answer there. I think there's a danger of some damage, but look, the nature of democracy, the new person gets elected, they're entitled to try their things, and I'm hoping, even though I disagree with some of these policies, that the school system improves. And some of the things he's done, like pre-K, if he gets good quality pre-K, if it's not just a replication of a lot of what happened under Head Start, he'll be fine. The things that he's changed the A to F report card because people really hated the fact that you shine such a bright spotlight. And he's kind of buried the lead on that. I've always thought it really helped parents. Another story I tell in the book, it's one of my favorite. New York Times, because they're very clever, these Times reporters. And when I gave my A to F story, they would always point out that with 1,500 schools, a couple of the letter grades didn't seem to make sense. And they would write stories about it. And so one of the reporters who wrote the story, who was laughing at me, and I happened to have breakfast with her, and I said, where are you going to send your kids? She said, well, I was going to send them to PS19, but it got a C on its progress report. So when it came to her kids, she didn't find it so amusing. But so I thought that. Then last week, they changed something which I felt pretty strongly about, which is we really eliminated much of the bureaucracy in favor of a principal empowerment move. We set up these organizations, some internal, some external, and a principal could decide basically what support organization she wanted. And so that whole top-down bureaucracy, they undid that, or at least much of that last week, which concerns me.
I mean, centralized things at Tweed again.
Yeah, a re-centralization, which concerns me. But why did they do that? I think because they like to, bureaucracies like to exercise control. And and there's also a belief, there's something that drives me nuts about being a stranger to this world. People believe you ascend the bureaucracy because you're better and better at what you're doing. And therefore you should insist on exerting your power to make the schools better. That's why my superintendents told me they should pick the assistant principals for their principals, because they were smarter. And I kept thinking to myself, people don't understand the way organizations run. You can't parachute in like that. So, but that's the way, and it grows up out of a culture that's basically a monopoly school system. I mean, Cuomo said it, he's way out there right now, because when you're used to that, what you begin to understand is the way power works. And everything I try to do is diffuse power as much as possible and make the most powerful person in the system the principal. That was what my goal was from day one. They want to reestablish and make the two most powerful people in the system, the union and the bureaucrats.
Right. I'm sorry, the gentleman, behind you, unfortunately, his hand's been up the whole time. Plus, you're an old friend of the Institute, you'll understand.
Thank you for your time. Fascinating talk. I'm a TFA alumni and formerly a New Orleans education technology entrepreneur. My question is, to what extent are you concerned about the emergence of a new status quo but the high-performing charters aren't necessarily innovating or investing heavily in R&D and are just quote-unquote scaling what works,
Yeah,
especially in light of college persistence rates and lack of socioeconomic diversity.
I'm
in
very
schools.
concerned about it. I'm glad you brought it up because
And the gentleman in front of him who I passed it over just a minute ago. Yeah.
But it's a critical issue, and again, they're, as you say, what they're trying to do is scale what they have. But the good news about Common Core and the new aligned tests is all of a sudden they're going to have to start to look at their whole card and spend a lot more time thinking about innovation and change. In Shanker's view, charters was supposed to become the laboratory of innovation, and too much they've become cookie cutter. That doesn't mean that some basic stuff they're doing they shouldn't be doing. But I would like to see them more innovative. It's funny, I just was on a phone call this weekend just on this subject, but you're on to a big thought.
Given your belief in choice, what is your opinion on school vouchers?
You know,
Get you last.
my own opinion on vouchers, it raises a lot of challenges, the whole issue of religious schools and all the other things. I guess if my kid was stuck in a school that I really thought was a dead-end school, and there were no charter seats available, and I could get him or her into a private school, I would want it. And so if I think I want something for myself, I usually use that as a pretty good moral outpost for what I would want for other people's children. I've always seen the problems in it, but at some point there is something about a kid who's in the 4th grade and you know that nothing's happening, and it ain't gonna happen. It didn't happen in the 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. You gotta do something. And there may come a world, it's a world that I'd like to see, like New Orleans, where you get the capacity you need. But New Orleans is quite rare and small. So trying to build, if I try to build in New York what Walter did in New Orleans would have been tough.
Yep.
Hi, Stephen Balkin with the Family Online Safety Institute. The Gates Foundation invested $100 million into the InBloom organization, which was to privatize student data to make the whole machine work a lot quicker and more efficiently. Parents groups, particularly in New York State, campaigned vigorously against it, and InBloom collapsed. What do you think they got wrong, and what's the future for privatizing student data?
So what they got wrong, I think, is they didn't understand what hit them. They didn't know that, in fact, right now, student data is less secure than it would have been in InBloom, if you care about privacy. That's just a fact, but they didn't anticipate this argument. They didn't get their communication strategy. And second of all, there is a real problem. You see this in the federal government. The president just called for legislation on it. There is a real concern parents have about the privacy of student data. In a world in which people get it hacked in all over, you know, North Koreans are hacking into Sony and so forth and so on, people get a little nervous about what kind of data is going to be held. So I think really demanding real privacy data, whether it's in the public school sector or in something like InBloom. Will it happen? I think it will happen. I think we got set back, unfortunately, over InBloom because I think it would have made it so much easier nationally to follow kids and to enable teachers to be empowered. But there is a scare factor right now.
In the way back there, yep.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm a former DC Public Schools employee and a big fan of Chancellor Henderson. One question for you would be, just in terms of looking at the leadership of superintendents across the country, who is giving you hope right now in terms of fixing up the school systems right now?
Certainly Kaya is. I think she's terrific. I think Tom Boasberg, who's out in Denver right now, is doing some good stuff. I mean, there are a lot of people in different places that are doing good work, and I don't want to, once you start going down a list of people, you leave somebody out and stuff. But I would say, though, it's, again, it shows how dysfunctional politics can be. The average soup in the United States serves for 3 years, which is nuts. It just makes no sense. I mean, you know, I served for 8.5 years, which was the longest serving chancellor since before World War II, I think, in New York. And that kind of span of years, 8 to 10 years, seems to me to be about right. And we're churning people way too quickly. So the people, I think, I mean, Kaya also, she was Michelle's deputy, so she's by now got in consecutively probably about 7, 8 years herself of being deputy. And that kind of leadership is really critical. But when I see these people getting burned out so quickly, the other guy I mentioned, Boasberg, has been there quite a long time now, too, 6, 7 years in Denver. And that's what I think. But on the other hand, the people I know are just getting ripped through like this. And the more controversial you are, the harder it is. If Bloomberg didn't have my back, if I had a school board, I would have been gone a lot sooner.
Like John D.C. Alma?
Like Daisy.
Alma Gilding. Excuse me. I was intrigued by your discussion about the lack of teaching knowledge. I've sat in on many classrooms for my grandchildren, and they're good schools, they're private schools, but there is a great emphasis on how do you feel?
How do you feel?
And so that's to invoke your creativity, of mind and your innovation. But I am a strong believer that you have to teach the background, the foundation, to become creative. And how did you balance that in the New York system?
I confess in the book, I didn't do it well. I learned it, so this was not my thing, and so I focused less on it in the beginning and got it wrong. There's something very convivial about talking about how do you feel, or the number of times, and it's great to read a book about how if the cow doesn't share the hay with the horse, they both starve to death, and so I get all of this, and that's all cool. So, but it's really important to know history and to know science. And when people say to me, well, you can look it up in Google, I mean, my jaw falls through my chest. The idea that we're going to have higher order thinkers who are looking up history or science in Google rather than build the knowledge base. Mm-hmm. And it's just shocking to me. So but what I worry about is it's really a dominant view now that facts, and I don't mean memorization of facts, I mean learning. You want to be a creative thinker, read a little bit of Aristotle. It'll help you think creatively. A little bit of Plato wouldn't be a bad thing.
And Shakespeare, right, Ken? Right. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you.
That
This is
Ken
a
over
wonderful
there?
session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken.
In all your years of this, we're talking about schools and the importance of schools and principals and all. Has there been any new insights on how learning takes place? How do people learn?
That's actually a great question. This is why I read a lot of Dan Willingham on how people learn. But one of the ways people learn is through the acquisition of background knowledge. It becomes a building block in their ability to learn. We're starting, Carol Dweck and some of the other people, how you inculcate persistence and getting kids engaged and sticking with it. And then some of the things we're now learning, including with all the work you've done on Shakespeare, but getting kids to be able to see some Shakespeare as well as read it creates visuals in the brain. But we're at the 1 yard line, not just in terms of learning theory, but in terms of what we know about the brain. If you ask me, the next generation is going to be on research on the mind and brain. A friend of mine just opened up at Columbia a huge thing called the Mind-Brain Behavior Institute. And I think sort of the last great thing in medicine was on the genome. I think we're now going to do the connectome. And I think it's going to be very, very powerful. So I wish I had a better answer, but I think both my lack of knowledge and the fact that the next 10 years, I think we'll learn a lot more.
Part of the point of these things is to sell really great books. The book is for sale by Politics and Prose out there. I know there were a few people I think I saw who had hands and questions, but the good thing is we'll stick around. We can have a cup of coffee. Joel can sign books, and we'll continue the conversation informally. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you.
Very good. You must have done